Hola. Hola, buenas tardes a todos.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for deciding to join us for this discussion. I'm Laura Sommer. I'm the Chequeado Director. That is the first organization that is devoted to fact-checking in Argentina. I'm a lawyer by training, and I have been working in favor of open government and open data and access to information for many years. We have a panel made up of Argentine panelists, but we decided not to focus exclusively on Argentina. And I have with me Delia Ferreira Rubio, who is the president of Transparency International, and we all know her. She has been working for decades on this arena, and we are going to ask her to share with us some thoughts, some criticism, some questioning to the funding systems used for political parties. And then we have Nicolas Dassen, who is the responsible for open government at the Inter-American Development Bank, and before he was an official in the Argentine government, providing consultancy on different issues related to transparency. Then we have Paula Bertol, who is the Secretary of the Parliamentary Relations and Administration Secretariat and the Cabinet of Ministers of the government in the ruling party, Cambiemos, and she has been working on transparency from a parliamentary standpoint. And finally, we have somebody that I'm very happy to have with us on this panel. He is not usually a speaker on this kind of panels, and it is Matias Lames, the president of a soccer team club, one of the largest ones in Argentina, San Lorenzo. And as you know, and you may have been following up with the news, soccer in our country is not at its best currently because there has been lack of transparency in the use of the funds allocated to this sport. He is from the civil society, but he's not a traditional member of civil society who promotes transparency. But I'm sure that adding to our work people like him could be really beneficial for us in promoting many of the policies and ideas that we would like to materialize. I will make a very brief introduction because what I care the most is for you to listen to the speakers. But let me put you in context. We all agree on the fact that corruption is one of the big problems of Argentina and Latin America. According to the World Economic Forum and data from 2015, corruption was one of the main factors affecting businesses in the region, together with the problems of red tape. And according to 2016 data from Latino Barometro, the citizens of Latin America and the Caribbean place corruption as the fourth most difficult problem after the criminality, unemployment, and the economy. So I think it is worth exploring these topics here. The Lava Jato case in Brazil has revealed in an unprecedented manner that corruption has no boundaries, that in order to investigate into corruption cases, you need independence in the judiciary power, the law enforcement authorities. So we should wonder why this case happened in Brazil now and not in any other country years ago, in countries that may be as corrupt as Brazil. But Brazil has a good performance if you look at Brazil in the indexes of access to information and other indexes. However, this case stands out as the perfect case to teach what we want to prevent from happening. So let me start with the first question for Delia in order to put us in a regional context. What are the trends that you see in the region as regards the fight against corruption? Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for being with us. I'm very pleased to be sharing this panel with these other speakers. In order to be fast and to have time to discuss many issues, let me just highlight some of the trends that we see across the region as well as in other regions across the world. Our region is still in the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. We still find Argentina. And corruption is clearly a problem. It is reflected on the competitiveness indexes and other indices that are published. And corruption is placed in a central position in the public agenda, although that agenda sometimes lowers its priority. The countries that are above the middle point of that list, where 100 means a transparent country and 0 as a corrupt country, Uruguay has 72 points, Chile 66, and Costa Rica 58. And these are the 3 countries in the region that are in that category. Argentina is below 136. So in the scale in school, from 1 to 0, we have failed. We haven't passed the test. So people have gotten tired of corruption, and this has led to significant mobilization, some with very significant political consequences. Demonstrations and mobilization in Brazil that did not start with the Lava Jato case, but actually started with corruption cases identified as a result of the organization of the World Cup, where it was clear that there was a serious corruption problem, and then this translated into problems also with the sale of tickets. In Nicaragua and in Honduras, where we saw mobilizations also with the same intention. In the Dominican Republic, a country that has maintained that kind of mobilization, the so-called green rallies. These are rallies that started because of the Lava Jato and the Odebrecht cases, and this has to do not only with corrupt practices in contracting settings in the country, but the headquarters of Odebrecht to handle all these bribes was located in the Dominican Republic. So these rallies, these demonstrations, show that people are willing to fight against corruption, or at least to participate somehow in the fight against corruption. The global barometer that Transparency International has shown recently shows that 70% of respondents in Latin America are willing to take part in the fight against corruption. So this is a positive signal. The third trend is that the courts and the judiciary has begun to work. So there is less impunity in the region. And the courts have done that in different ways. In some countries, clearly that is the case of Brazil through champions, the Attorney General and the prosecutor. In these cases have served as champions in the fight against corruption. Without their leading role, it would have been very difficult for Brazil to get to this point. In other cases, international teams have been set up. In the case of Guatemala, with CICIG, that worked a lot with corruption in the prior administration and also in this administration. And the work they did resulted in the removal of the head of the committee, and this and he couldn't be expelled from the country. And in the MASID uses the OAS instead of the United Nations as a basis. And the third model is that of Argentina, where the ordinary courts, the ones that were asleep for a long time, now have awakened. So this brings about a number of challenges in terms of the sustainability of these models. Then we also have the implementation of new entities within the framework of the judiciary system. The whistleblowers, the protection of witnesses, those that regret having participated in a crime, so they start collaborating with law enforcement. So that is something that we see now in Argentina. In recent years, we have seen in the region the emergence of the first big case of corruption, that is the Lavallato Odebrecht case, not only in terms of contracting, but also in terms of funding of political parties. It has been shown through the statements given in these cases that the money has been used to fund the campaigns of thousands of candidates in Brazil, and many other campaigns in which then the candidates for president said that they didn't know anything. Then there is some coordination between investigation units, and their Attorney General's office has been very important. The Ombudsman's offices have been very important because this goes beyond the traditional tools, and these are not effective enough to deal with this. So here we are incorporating organized crime as another element, and this requires a lot of cooperation. And something that is disappearing is something that we see now is the concern in the private sector with regards to integrity and compliance. In Argentina, we have a law that now establishes the liability of corporations according to the acts of they have done in the company. So now the focus is shifting towards these areas. Thank you. The plan is to have these kind of remarks for the first few minutes. Perhaps half of the time allotted will be devoted to this kind of presentations, and then we will take questions from the floor. So if you want, you can start writing questions down so that you don't forget, and during the second half of this panel, we will address them. The second question is for Nicolas Gassen, and this has to do with the view of the IDB regarding the corruption scandals that we saw in the region. Delia mentioned a few of the most resonating cases. So, and what is the attitude that your organization undertakes? At the IDB, we view these corruption scandals as an opportunity to move forward with institutional reforms that are still outstanding. This gives us a window of opportunity that has just been opened. In Chile, for instance, as a result of corruption scandals with conflicts of interest, the convergence of money and political parties, the government, with the support of the IDB, set up an advisory council that was called the Engel Committee that came up with an agenda on transparency and integrity. So this included 21 legislative measures and 14 administrative measures. And this is what is now being reformed and changed in the last 2 years. We also support the Attorney General's Office of Colombia on everything that has to do with conflicts of interest and integrity-related issues. And in Bolivia, for instance, we provide support to try to recover assets for $30 million approximately from government suppliers that were not complying with the delivery of the services they were hired for. So this led to some surety insurance, and that was something that allowed us to recover those assets. So sometimes it is difficult to make progress in this arena. And we also did something to eliminate the bureaucracy, the red tape that existed in the government. There was a competition, a contest that we organized called El Peor Trámite de mi Vida. That is the worst process in my life. It had to do with elderly women that would have to go through 3 different municipal departments in Bolivia to get an ID card, and in between they were told to come back later, or they were eventually asked for a bribe to get that ID card. So now we are talking about an agenda to eliminate bureaucracy. Thank you, Nicolás.
Con vos.
Paula, if you agree, we are going to continue with you talking about Argentinian policies. And the question is, considering his political history, President Macri does not have corruption in his list of priorities. There is, however, fight against poverty and against drug trafficking, but you cannot find necessarily the fight against corruption as a priority and in his agenda. However, this is present when you see that the justice is reactivated or activated, at least for those who lost power, or it seems more active in this universe of possible accused than in the total universe. The question is what policies were adopted in these almost 2 years of government in terms of fight against corruption. Thank you, Laura. It is an honor for me to be here as a member of this panel, and thanks to all the audience. First of all, let me say that the lines of campaign, presidential campaign, were, as you say, the fight against drug trafficking and poverty. But we were, when managing the city of Buenos Aires, we had been working strongly on transparency and anti-corruption. A very significant illustration of this is that the city of Buenos Aires set up the single stop, which removed the intermediation with the political intermediation with the poorest population, and the state took on its responsibilities. And besides the campaign lines, the president assumed a challenge which was very clear since he took office in the fight against corruption. We say that we are what we do. Now we say that we're doing what we are supposed to be doing. And since the inception of our government, we submitted strong initiatives to Congress, the strongest of which being that after 15 years, we managed to have the law of access to public information passed. And since August, we have the Anti-Corruption Office in operation, led by Bertoni, a professional elected after consultation of civil society, which was unheard of. This was not required by law. However, we believed that there was no one better than civil society organizations to promote nominees, because in the past, for 15 years, Argentina had been trying once and again to find ways to promote the law, to give transparency to public information so that citizens, without giving any justification, could have access to data held by the state, and this was a huge initiative. Another area of self-regulation is in public advertising, which in our country is a source of suspicion. Probably Matias is familiar with this, because with football, official or public funded advertising is very much related to sports, but they are still debated in Congress. We are also working with the law on political financing, because we believe that politics should be made transparent. As we can see in nearby countries, our neighbor countries, Brazil, for instance, this is a situation that impacts us. And in relation to corruption, whistleblowing, and the repented as a legal entity, something that it's an outstanding issue. Some of these bills are being debated in Congress. Some of them passed by one of the houses, and some of them the creation of the modernization ministry is an indication of the transparency in it effort. And as the president said, transparency is related to integrity, to the virtue of honesty, and we believe in his words. When he took office, he said we would be relentless in our fight against corruption. So in many of the bills we sent to the Congress are related to this. We also believe that it is necessary to introduce a modification of the Judiciary Council because transparency and justice is essential. And another statement of his that impacted me as a politician, I was looking for someone to follow, was his phrase that he says there will be no judges responding to our government. Unfortunately, that is not the case for the rest of Latin America. There were members of the judiciary who used this phrase, at some point in time, you will be in the title of a file case, warning that they were in control. Well, from the very first day of our administration, we've been very clear that if any of our officials is suspected of anything, as it has happened, they have to go to justice, first of all. And also, several reforms were introduced for instance, the Anti-Corruption Office has worked a lot in the sworn statements of public servants. That was not something that we did not have in our laws, because our law provided for that, but it was not enforced. There are many examples to follow. In Chile, for example, they have been pioneers with their anti-corruption office and procedures in their parliament. Their parliament has an ethics commission, which our Congress does not have. So we've started a fundamental trail of actions against corruption, but I guess I'm sure that we still have a lot to do. For those of you who are especially interested in access to information, a topic referenced by Paula, an outstanding issue we were claiming for decades, there was a paper published this week in chequeado.com that is entitled Infometer, which measures how much information is published by each ministry, comparing the previous government, Kirchner's administration, and the current situation. And the Infometer is designed to alert and show what we know, that the state is not just one, though we may simplify it. And the results of the Infometer measures 4 variables: institutional information, the information that citizens can find for administrative procedures, the friendliness or usability of websites, and how much information based on what the law provides is actually available to evaluate and measure policies. As a result, the average of the previous administration was 5.7, and the average of the current government is 6.3. And this represents an improvement. They have not flunked, as Delia said, but there is a long way to go. And when you go into the details, into the breakdown of this 6.3, There is the Ministry of Science and Technology, which was the best in the previous administration and has got the best performance in the current one with scores above 8. And there are other ministries in the past, the Ministry of Planning, led by Julio De Vido, and the current Ministry of Social Development, held by Carolina Stanley, with scores below 5, 4.6 actually. So the dispersion or the possibilities under the same rules, with the same government, with a similar vocation, still reveals significant asymmetries many of us have to work on. Now, let's move on to Matthias. After Denise has made this introduction of the sector of the football, which gives us a lot of joy, but also a lot of concern. The FIFA gate shows, as Lavajato does, that the problems of non-transparency or bribery is not just for football. There is not just one Grondona in the world. And whenever we talk about corruption and making a self-criticism of the press, we always focus ourselves on the public sector. We always look at one side, and we all know that there is no bribe if there is not someone who will pay for it. So it would be interesting to know, how do you see this situation, and what have you decided to do? Not just because the law requires you to do something, but proactively from your club, San Lorenzo. Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for being here. It's an extreme pleasure for me to be here. Our initiative starts or stems from the paradoxal situation that football is part of our culture, is in our idiosyncrasy in Argentina. However, an increasing number of fans felt alien to football because the sports leadership has lost trust. It has been questioned on an ongoing basis because of several factors, because of fixing up the matches, the FIFA gate, decisions made by leaders that are bribed to decide one way or another. So in that context, in San Lorenzo, we reflected on what we could do that should be disruptive and heard of in the Argentine football. And we worked with Volosín and Barreira, who are experts, and we started with a brainstorming to see what we could do to get out, to take the football out of this obscurantism and this feeling in the Argentine society, this sensation that is certainly deserved, that feels that football decisions are taken overnight by 4 or 5 guys in a dark room and is never in the headlines. So this should be broken somehow. So in San Lorenzo, we established an open data portal with all the hard management data in revenues, expenses, budget execution. And we wondered if that was enough, because we said, okay, this open data is something that we cannot avoid. They are essential, but we were expecting a cultural change. The organization, we wanted it to be prepared for those who are going to succeed us. We say, we are honest, we know it, but we have to replicate that on rules so that our successors will have a normative framework penalizing any deviation and preventing their occurrence. So why a comprehensive transparency manual? It's not just open data. There is a procurement manual. We have a code of ethics, which we are the only club that has. There is an anonymous denunciation box or mailbox. So this is a tool of open data, not just for management transparency and cultural change, but also we use it as a management tool because we feel that it improves democracy. It is democratizing. In these few months of being implemented in this anonymous reporting mailbox, we find not only denunciations, but also questions. Why have you spent on this? Or suggestions that, for instance, one of the recommendations was the use of wind power generation. So why am I talking about this? This open data portal is a management tool to improve the management, not just to make it transparent, but in this back and forth, it could be an interesting management tool. Now, the FIFA gate and the rest, well, does not come as a surprise to us, and I think this should be gone through along two paths. On the one hand, we have these disruptive measures, and when we started exploring, we've seen them in the rest of the world, not only Argentina. But in football specifically, I think we have to work strongly to replace the leaders, a change of leaders that should be pushed from civil society. And I feel that happening. People are beginning to question how things are being done. I believe that the world of football is sieged by civil demands, civil society demands, and that is good. We welcome that, because what we are witnessing now has actually been happening for years. There was a time when we had a hard fight in the Argentine Federation trying to change the heading of 40 years of leadership by Grondona. That was not successful. There was a tie. But in processes like this, and back to our topic of discussion here, is that processes like this, we are going to implement this in the Argentine Super League of open data, but not just open data, because it could look as self-complacency. We should go further with a comprehensive plan comprising rules for this behavior, for this attitude to be long-standing, ruling all members of society, all members of the club and the Super League. That is the way to go. Not just open data, but go for maybe a more complex process, but to regulate the behavior of all these people. I think that may be the way out of the serious crisis that football is undergoing now in terms of transparency. Well, thank you very much for your presentations. Now I will make you a couple of questions. I request your quick and brief answers, and then a second round of questions. Delia, Nicolas, Paula, Matias, if you had the chance to be the president of your country and you had to pick up one action of fight against corruption, which would that be?
I would give an order for the existing laws to be complied with and to also to fulfill the OGP commitments. Let me present to you two cases. This government of the city of Buenos Aires that has made a lot of progress is accumulating cases of non-reply to the request for information from citizens on issues that are difficult for them. So these cases have gotten to the courts, and even there they resist to provide that information that belongs to the citizens. So I think that commitment to access to information is essential. And another essential commitment is the understanding that OGP is not just a matter of open data. It is a matter of opening the government to participation. And we cannot continue to say that we are not allowing the participation of civil society, because that is not the law, as is the case of the ombudsman that is about to be appointed in Argentina, and I'm sure that some comments will be made later on. That is not written in the law, so we are not going to have this as a participatory system. So which section in the law says that that appointment should be decided in an evening meeting among politicians without the presence of any other else. And that is not written in the law either, and this is how they are appointing the ombudsman. This is one measure that I'm asking you to choose. I would ask, you are the president. You shouldn't ask the president. You are the president. If I'm the president, I would call my Minister of Finance and I would say that it is worth investing in public expenditure control systems because that is an investment, not an expense. And then I would ask the Ministry of Justice and the Foreign Affairs Ministry to review all the international legislation on international cooperation because there are many problems there to ask for the help of judges. And if you allow me, I will ask the Congress to do away with or to have a law on the extinguishment of property ownership. If I were president of the country, if I were the president of the country, I would insist on making my officials accountable. I would ask them to think whether a certain expense is absolutely necessary from the point of view of our citizens before they incur in that expense. And many people get carried away with the idea that they can walk on the red tape, so I would ask them to be fully accountable. If I were president, I would work on the independence of the branches of power. We feel that those that are now being prosecuted for corruption cases are the ones that have fallen in disgrace, and I feel that all of us have that feeling. And I think that something that was said here and that I agree on is that we need to work hard on the division of powers. We need to have a legislative power that fulfills its duties, as Paula said, but a judiciary that would not be dependent on the ruling or the administration, the current administration. Going beyond open data and what Delia said and what I tried to convey with my initial remarks in this feedback with the civil society, I think that it is very difficult to fight corruption, and I've seen this many years ago, without truly independent powers. And if you don't have judges, and when you have judges that are just trying to get the credit for themselves or to help somebody in particular, so I'm sure that that would be the starting point of a crazy fight against corruption. It is so difficult to be in the president's shoes, right? Another question for all of you. If we were to draw a line, and we have reasons to be optimistic and reasons to be pessimistic, and if we don't consider as our target for the next year, but for the next 5 years, where would you start? Let's start with Matthias so that we don't start always with the same round of answers. Optimistic, pessimistic reasons, and what would you do from here for the next 5 years? I think that the electoral I think that here, this current administration has learned how to understand and give people what they wanted. People were tired of the prior administration, the prior regimen. So now I think that this administration has understood that clearly. And what we see in the judiciary is something that gives us reason for concern, but usually the sentences are given when we are more sensitive, so perhaps it's difficult to be optimistic in that regard. But from For the next 5 years, I think that civil society will continue to be engaged, but we will continue to see a growing demand from civil society. And I have, in that sense, more reasons to be optimistic. I think that in 5 years' time, we will be better. Reasons to be optimistic, all. I truly believe in falling down and then standing up on your feet, getting back on your feet. We tend to be resilient and we look for support and love and affection to keep on going. The fact that Argentina is now part of OGP is a huge reason for optimism. I must confess that some time ago, when Argentina was not led by this administration, but a different one, I was surprised when, especially discussing issues related to transparency and anti-corruption, because in Argentina, what existed was secrecy, a lot of secrecy in most of the areas. So today, we are very happy to see that we are fulfilling and meeting many of the principles established by the OGP, that we have this basis for exchange of experiences and tools. So at a personal level, I believe that we are going to grow. But I also believe that in Latin America and all over the world, the fight against corruption will be enriched with this kind of discussion and with exchange of experiences. And this is closer available to us. Thank you. Reasons to be optimistic. I have two. One is that now we have citizens that are much more engaged, much more mobilized, much more informed, and at the IDB we also see an improvement in living standards. So citizens are asking for better service quality. And as Delia said, the social rallies against corruption also gives me a reason for optimism. Another reason to be optimistic is technology. Technology allows us to exert a better control of corruption and to be more efficient at identifying the risks. 5 years from now, I will be more cautious. Perhaps I'm an anxious person, but since the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption in 1997, it took us 20 years to pass a law on the access to information. And now there is a criminal liability law, but we also took a long time to get to the passing of that law. And at the regional level, we still have to undergo many reforms, and they will take a lot of time. So I think that we still need to continue in this path. I am naturally optimistic. Those who know me know that that is the case. I think there are many reasons to be optimistic, especially in the civil society, where we keep up our efforts, although things do not turn out as we expect. I think that we need to improve our work on strengthening those contexts that make this fight against corruption possible. And this means openness, dialogue, participation. It means creating a true political will, a true commitment, and to strengthen the demand from society. And a challenge that lies ahead of us, not to be pessimistic, but to be on the alert, is this is like a chess game. The black pieces are also in the game. So while we see this trend towards the anti-corruption, putting an end to impunity, and making headway in the path of transparency, we see a lot of amnesties, measures incorporated in general laws, and also pardoning of certain officials. For instance, we saw in Brazil that a certain official was pardoned with a lot of evidence that could be used also to prove that that was being used to finance politics. So there is still a lot to do in that regard. So before asking the audience to make their questions, I also have a list of questions that I could pose, but I would like to ask Delia and Nicolas And first to Nicolas to tell us if you know, based on your work, cases of innovation in the fight against corruption that are worth mentioning here so that people can learn more about those. 20 years ago, I started working in these subjects, and I still see the same practices or measures that we have been using for a long time. So we haven't been able to truly have the impact that we expected, and that is frustrating, and it leaves some people out of the fight. So that is so needed. So I think it's good to share these new forms of innovation to fight against corruption, if there are any. And Delia, this is just for you to start thinking about that. What are the reforms that are still outstanding at an institutional level in the region? You mentioned the three trends. So which would be those outstanding reforms that we still need to undertake? An example of innovation could be something that the IDB helped implementing in the Controller's Office in Brazil, and that is now the Ministry of Transparency. This is a big data tool that is called Government Spending Observatory, and in Brazil, they published all the figures and they update them very quickly. And in terms of procurement, for instance, this tool is capable of identifying the purchases of goods that happen in a direct manner and in a fragmented manner because they do not exceed the required amount for public tendering. So they issue a red flag because there is the assumption that the supplier is being chosen directly. And that tool has been useful. There are some licenses granted for fishing for certain periods of time. So during the ban periods, fishermen are given subsidies, of course, so that they can make a living until they can go back and fish again. So that system was useful also to identify subsidies that shouldn't have been granted to these fishermen. And this is a big data tool. Thank you. I think that we need to work on what Matthias mentioned, and that is institutional sustainability of what we are doing. It is not enough to have honest people in the government, because the day they leave, if we haven't institutionalized these practices, it would be like going backwards. So all countries in the region have that challenge. If you look at the shopping list of laws, you will find many laws. But we have to see what happens on the implementation side. Once I was doing an assessment of the anti-corruption office in one of the countries in the region. I called the prosecutor in charge of those corruption cases. The attorney general came, and he didn't. He said that he would meet me at a cafe. So I met him at that cafe. I spent 2 hours talking to him. He was constantly interrupted by the waiters because he got a lot of phone calls. So he would get up and leave me. So after those 2 hours of interview, I said, I'm curious that you didn't invite me to your office. If you want to come up, it's on the building, but I don't have internet. I don't have a secretary. I don't have a computer or Wi-Fi connection, so I come here. So these guys allow me to use their Wi-Fi connection, and they pick up my calls. So it was obvious that they could have all the laws in place, but obviously that was not working properly. So that is the challenge when it comes to truly institutionalizing the progress achieved. Then we also need to work on sustainability of the social demand. We know that the demand is there, but the civil society has a big challenge ahead, and that is how we are going to channel that social energy at the time when the period after they got infuriated, after they got outraged, because they can achieve results when they feel outraged. We see now the elections results in Brazil that seem to contradict what the society claimed for some time ago. So we need to create the spaces and the channels to channel that energy to make sure that they stick to what they believe in the period after they have taken to the streets and the rage has subsided. So I think that it is essential for us to have a strong, independent judiciary and a strong Attorney General's office. Otherwise, we won't be able to do anything. In the case of Argentina specifically, I believe that some of the things mentioned by Paula, some of the projects or bills that will be introduced into Congress, like the bill on financing of political parties, are important. We need a truly independent anti-corruption office that is still outstanding, and we need to work on a central issue, and that is conflicts of interest.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd like to know if there is any question from the floor. Anyone in the audience who wants to make a question? Will you hand over a mic, please? Please, when you make a question, say your name, your country, and be brief in your articulation. Thank you very much. I'm Felix Madariaga from Nicaragua, from the Institute of Strategic Studies for Delia. Based on your international experience, what can the international community do to be actually mandatory or binding in anti-corruption issues? We know the information is there. We know which governments or which officials are actually being corrupt. And if the national process does not move forward because of internal difficulties, the international community should not wait and see. So, according to your experience, what could be actions to improve the international community to impose binding sanctions on corrupt people? Thank you, Felix. I'm pleased to see you here. That is a central challenge, which I remember having worked in your country. In my opinion, the international community has the ability to put pressure beyond what the civil society can do in contexts where there is no democracy and where the risks of the nationals when they pose these issues, that it's a threat to their lives. It's a life risk. I believe multilateral organizations can do a lot when they grant funding, when they grant plans, when they develop contracting mechanisms or programs which eventually become another source of corruption in the receiving country. There are some multilateral organizations that have set up anti-corruption offices to put a stop of the improper use of the funds they deliver, or for improving the use. That's a step forward, but there is still a lot to be done. And joint work and the commitment of some countries, particularly those that sign international transparency agreements, but later that is the place where the corrupt in other countries or regions find to protect the output of corruption. So we find countries that are very well ranked in the corruption perception index with banks where the funds from less developed countries are invested, or nations that are under big corruption cases, or countries with a total opacity system in beneficial ownership issues or ownership in shareholding, in stock corporations, and that creates the signing of international agreements, creates a window of opportunity for the global corrupt. So here there is hypocrisy that we should repair. Any other question? Good afternoon. I'm Mariela Escudero. I represent a foundation that provides help for abuse victims. I work in the judiciary since I'm 18 of the province of Buenos Aires. A question for Paula Bertol and Matthias Lamens. The Anti-Corruption Office was created, and with regard to the independence of the judiciary, is there any means by which a citizen, a worker, an employee of the judiciary or of any institution, is there any means this person who witnesses a case of corruption can report it voluntarily and have at the same time the guarantees that he or she will not lose a job or see his family affected, but real guarantees, not these expression that you will be a protected witness and you will be guaranteed. But we all know that there are corruption situations which we all know, and we have to hush up because sometimes the job is at risk and sometimes the lives of our families. So if we start from the ground, we could fight corruption. Those who can witness, people can see, but are not really able to report it. Yes, we believe in a country that guarantees a peaceful life to their citizens, and that whenever they become aware of corruption cases, they pent up courage to report it. And the office enables this anonymous denunciation, but I'm guessing you are referring to something that goes further. So we are still working at the Senate on a law that, in case of reporting, grants protection. This is not something that politics has worked out. I'd like to see it worked out differently. I'd like to say as well, and I agree with Delia, that some things are decided or resolved where typically men decide in an office. Let me bring into the debate the gender issue, how in many of our Latin American countries still equality is a pending subject. But I'd like to have such a tool available for those who denounce corruption cases, do not feel threatened. I hope we will have it soon. And I give you my personal assurance that I will work on that. Let me make a comment here. Many chapters of Transparency International have local counseling, legal counseling, providing legal advice to people who face such problems or potential corruption problems. So let me urge you in each of your countries to contact our chapters and see if these centers of counseling can be the place where to find support, even though there may be no institutional mechanism that provide assurance for the reporting and sanctioning of corruption cases. The speaker is speaking in French. We apologize, the interpreters, but French is not being translated. If someone does not understand English, you have translation. There is no translation into Spanish, from French. Sorry, there is no translation from French. I will translate.
Indignation des citoyens qui voient aller dans les poches de la corruption un argent qui devrait leur servir à améliorer les services qu'on leur donne. Et est-ce que vous avez des objections à ce que les pays pionniers entreprenne une action auprès des Nations Unies pour que les Nations Unies, à l'instar des conventions contre l'apatridie, conventions pour les droits de l'homme, conventions pour le COP 21, que les Nations Unies établissent une convention à laquelle les pays pourraient souscrire et laquelle convention serait devenue contraignante pour aider quand même à ce que l'univers, que cette convention universelle serve quand même à mobiliser, motiver les États et les gouvernements à quand même s'adonner à la lutte contre la corruption. Ce serait un mouvement universel et je pense que ça irait très bien.
Bueno, nosotros...
Would you please translate the question for the rest? Will you please do it yourself? I think he's asking about the conventions, how we do not have a truly universal convention in the fight against corruption. There is a convention. There is an international convention, which is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And there is also a regional one, which is the OES Convention Against Corruption. Now, what happens with these conventions? That they do not have effective implementation mechanisms or sanctioning mechanisms. I was last week in Vienna at the meeting of the member states of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. All signatory states were there. After 2 days listening to ambassadors and representatives, country delegates, presenting before the assembly the reports on their countries, I said to the person from the Transparency International who was with me, I think we should work on something else, because based on what they are saying, everything works fine, everything works marvelously, and there is no corruption here. Now, corruption still exists, and in particular, with the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the UNCTAD, it doesn't have an effective tracking mechanism which the OES Convention does have. So the American Convention in that respect is more powerful, without prejudice of the fact that the international law in many of its norms lacks the coercion factor that the regional mechanisms do have. So what we should do is to achieve effective implementation and enforcement of those rules. We need commitment, not discourses or speeches. Is there any other question? I'm Martin from Argentina. I wanted to ask the legislator what is a parliamentary activity preventing the families or the relatives of officials to be embedded in schemes of corruption, the property assets, for instance. What is the strategy that Congress will carry forward to prevent the use of families as a source of illicit funds? Martin, please give us your last name. I'm Martin Alvarez. Martin Alvarez, I'm not a legislator. I work in the executive. I was a legislator for 80 years. What we are now doing is to show ourselves. We show up. There is a self-regulation in the executive. We wanted to set the example from the beginning, and we promoted another law, which is the law on lobbying. So whenever there is doubt, from the president to the last official, what we do is we show up, we appear before the press, who typically intermediate between civil society, and that is what we do at all times. In addition to having contracting open platforms, but public officials, whenever a government official has had a minor doubt on any of the things you refer to, what they've done is to answer questions and go to justice voluntarily. Now we will have the last questions. There are many hands raised, but the organizers have asked us to be strict with time. I am Adrián Pino from Datos Concepción. My question is for Delia. What recommendations would you make to governments who say they want to move forward in transparency projects? In the specific case for the prevention of conflicts of interest, and which other guarantee mechanisms should exist for control organizations or agencies have active participation of civil society organizations so that we do not have these fights such as the one we are having with the Ombudsman or the situation with the Office of Access to Public Information. I mean, what models can we have or do you recommend with active participation of civil society so that we have proper audit agencies? There is no universal model. Each country should establish its own. The way to ensure those spaces is through the proper legislation that gives guarantees so that we are not given the reply we've had this morning of the senator responsible for the proposition of the ombudsperson when she said that there is no section in the law that provides for our obligation to consult with you. So we need a law with that section. However, such a law is no guarantee. And just an actual and real will and commitment, again, commitment and not words, commitment with participation. There is nothing that prevents participation. And when governments are satisfied and have as a goal being in spaces like the OECD or OGP, they are committing. And this commitment of participation, well, doesn't require a law to be performed. So I think we could already move forward. Obviously, the second step would to have it institutionalized, because otherwise we will have a commitment by current officials who will not be here tomorrow, and then we lose the space and we have to start over. So I guess we can work along that path. In addition, we should make a huge strengthening of the independence of control agencies. And he referred to a reform of the National Auditor's Office. And this office, we should think it was a stronghold of control during the 12 years of the Kirchner's administration. And they were given heads up on disasters like the train crash. And however, this should be reformed. This office should be provided with more tools for more effective control. And control should not end up in signaling problems. When you work, and I've had the pleasure of working in the Congress and in the auditor's office, we very well know that it could be a very elaborate report of the auditor's office that will go to the Congress. Very few will read it. It will go to the decision with just a figure. In a long list of many cases, hands will be raised, and that's when it will die. And there may be an interested congressman or woman who might submit a request for information to the executive asking, what have you done with the auditor's recommendations and what will happen? We will probably never get an answer to that question. And those reports, this is something that we should ask for and demand, and these reports should be made public, because typically civil society was the one that, with this auditor's report, the one that submitted requests for public information or modifications of public policies. So participation should exist. In the 21st century, we shouldn't be discussing for or against participation. This is a right that we have already earned. Thank you, Delia, Nicolás, Paula, and Matthias, and thank you all for being here with us today. I hope you've taken an inspiring message from us.